Hi, I'm James Turner. I'm an advisor with IBRS. We're an Australian advisory firm which is dedicated to supporting organisations with a responsible and sustainable use of technology. Today I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Joe Sweeney, who is talking about digital workspaces for a digital workforce. Joe, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, can you please tell me, digital workspaces for a digital workforce, where did this come from?
Well, over the last decade and a bit, we've been doing a lot of work with clients, both through consulting and advisory service and so forth, and many interviews in the last year alone, over 115 of them, into what does the workforce of the future look like? That's the first step. And then how do you tool up? How do you create a strategy to deal with that future state?
So, predicting future workforce needs.
So look, one of the things that we do know, and this has been reported on extensively in the media, in some cases maybe hyped a little bit, in other cases misunderstood and underestimated by a lot, is that the coming workforce will not look like the workforce that we've had in the past. And it's not about just changing skill sets, it's actually about how people will be hired. Australia is rapidly heading in the direction of the United States, where there'll be a much greater casualisation of the workforce. Increasingly, people won't view themselves as having a career. What they'll do is they'll view themselves as having a set of skills which they can sell between multiple organisations. So organisational structures start to get a lot looser, a lot flatter. As we saw with the advent of the mainframe and the flattening of organisations, we're going for another range of that. There was a great comment made by a person who was both a CIO and an HR manager of a fairly sizable and complex organisation here in Australia. And he said, and quite insightful, that the coming workforce views work differently, fundamentally differently. They're collaborative, we know that. They're very flexible. They're constant relearners. To some extent maybe shallow, but they're definitely relearners. But they're very purpose-driven. So if they don't have a clear job and they don't have the right tools to do that clear job, they're just not going to do it. It's not going to be effective. So it's a very different approach to the type of tools they want, to the type of work they're doing, and how they will be hired.
So, and also just because I'm aware that our listeners will have probably pricked up their ears when you said it as well, what do you mean by shallow?
Well, one of the things is that the skill sets that are being created here are basically skill sets based on process. In other words, what is the best process to get this job done in the most efficient way? What they don't see themselves as needing is to understand every single part of that business. So stitching all of that together requires more than just the superficial collaboration attitude that we've got at the moment, which is give people messaging and they'll be fine. There actually has to be a very deep approach for maintaining corporate knowledge inside the technology and inside the tools that you're giving this diaspora, this broader group of employees.
Okay, the digital workspace.
The notion of the traditional office space is changing. It's not just about activity-based working, it's not about teleworking, it's actually the fundamental tools themselves, how we think about them needs to change. Quite frankly, the standard operating environment model that we've used to reduce costs and create standardization, which has stood us fairly good for a long while, is not going to support us. What we need is a new model. It has to be flexible enough to enable this new workforce to engage with it and to be able to take what they need from this new environment. In this model, basically, the concept of the device becomes transient, which is completely opposite of how we've managed things in the past. The concept of the application also becomes, to some extent, transient. The information is the hub of this, and the process is what envelops it. And that's all that we need to be really focusing on.
So why digital workspaces matter? Now this is an interesting one.
Yes. Look, this particular slide is actually described in more detail in a lengthy research paper that we call a MAP, a Master Advisory Presentation. But the key takeout from this, and this has been based on many real-world examples of when we've done consulting work, but also when we were talking with these over 115 other CIOs and CTOs, what we do know is that if you migrate from your existing heavy desktop / mobility sort of approach to how you deploy the end user compute environment to a digital workspaces environment, due to the consumerization of technology and a whole range of other factors, you can see cost savings anywhere of 20, which is at the low end, to up to about 48.7% in one case. Now, here's the rub with this. Yes, you can save money, you can rationalize a lot in your IT spend. That's not the reason why you do this. Because if you take that approach, you will get no innovation, which is what you want, which is the bottom quadrant of this chart. What you need to do is take those savings, those considerable savings, and reinvest them into new ways of expanding the workforce capabilities. And that is a real difficult, that idea of the innovation dividend, that taking innovation from within the IT department and handing it back to the business and then reinvesting that back into IT, that's something that a lot of Australian organisations really struggle with. And it's a cultural issue, it's a management issue, it's not an IT issue, but you need to be aware of that.
Just listening to you talk about that, I was thinking it's kind of like food, isn't it? You know, you can buy the cheapest food to eat for dinner, but you probably don't want to because it's probably not going to give you what you want.
I do like a good burger, but I'm fat and unhealthy.
So the journey ahead, this is an infographic that you've covered in another presentation, but it ties directly into what you're talking about here, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Look, I think the key thing is that a lot of organisations need to realise that they are probably at the low end of this scale, and that's absolutely fine. I mean, everyone's starting from some point. So you're either starting with a standard operating environment, or if you've done more work on automation and so forth of that environment, you could call it a managed operating environment. Now, to get from there to the digital workspaces, which is this much more fluid as a service delivery model environment, that requires a lot of new ways of thinking about the role of end user computing. It also requires some fundamental technologies that you can see listed down the bottom of that chart, but more importantly, it requires some changes within the business about how they think about end user computing, which are listed across the top. Now, if you get the digital workspaces right, that enables the workforce itself to begin innovating, finally leading to what we call workforce transformation, which is really those big disruptive changes that are not driven by what's happening on the ground. They're enabled by it, but that's actually driven from the top. Those are serious, large-scale business decisions about disrupting business models. Now, those are coming. As I've mentioned in the previous video, they're definitely coming. What we need to focus on as technologists is that middle section, the digital workspaces, because that's the key that unlocks that digital workforce innovation.
But it sounds like there's a potential pitfall here.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Look, the pitfall. Interestingly, a lot of people would say, "Oh, it's the business is resistant and to change and so forth," and that to some extent is true. But one of the biggest resistance factors of this is actually the IT department itself. So,
which I have just clicked to.
Which you have just clicked to. Amazing. The reality.
It's as though I knew.
It's as though, yes. Look, what we've discovered through some very, very hard knocks, I have to confess, but also from listening to other CTOs, particularly the CTOs and the CDOs, the Chief Digital Officers, is that they struggle, even when there's a strong, compelling case for a digital workspace, they struggle to get it through the traditional end-user compute teams. It's actually a bottleneck. It doesn't sit at the top layers of IT. It doesn't sit at the bottom layers. It sits in this really traditional group. And that's because over 30 years, we have absolutely perfected the art of delivering a desktop. Now, some end users might go, well, no, but the reality is we know how to drive down costs. We know how to automate the delivery of desktop services. We've tried to apply that to mobility, not very well, but there's a whole range of best practices that have been very well documented. But here's the problem. Those best practices no longer apply given the technology and the culture that we're moving into. They simply are the wrong practices. And the challenge is that these are so deeply embedded in our IT culture and how we're funded and how we're remunerated and how we're recognized, that it's really hard to move away from them. And in many cases, and we explicitly did some research on this, in many cases, when you start probing organizations, they don't know they have got assumptions about how you deliver end-user compute. And so the first thing that we've got to do is surface those assumptions and then realize that there's new ones. Good news is it's a great little activity. You can actually run a very simple workshop over a lunch break and really start to get an organization to rethink what are these assumptions. Let me give you some examples. One of the assumptions is that total cost of ownership is a major factor, a major consideration when you're going out to market for a new end user compute strategy. It's not. That is the wrong metric. What the correct metric should be is staff productivity and staff enablement. It's a very different thing from TCO. Most TCO pretends to look at that, it doesn't. So there's a whole range of assumptions that need to be challenged, need to be serviced. And if you can do that, and again, it only takes a day, if you can do that well, that totally opens up all these new possibilities for the digital environment. If you don't do this well, any attempts to reinvigorate end user compute will just fall flat on their face time after time after time.
Fascinating, and I think any security people listening to this would naturally be experiencing that discomfort you can have when an assumption is challenged.
Oh, yes.
Like locking down a desktop. But then, there's a valid argument to be made that if there's a good baseline from a hygiene perspective, and you've actually thought about the architecture and the roles and access of the users that are interfacing with that data, there's a good argument to be made that you can actually relinquish the tightness in some of the other areas.
Absolutely. Now, don't mistake what I'm saying here. Some of these principles and some of these assumptions still will hold true. The question is, you really need to challenge them, and you need to think, what new assumptions do we need to make? Because you need a new set of principles. And there are very good reasons for having fully locked down devices in many organizations, and there's other parts of that workforce that might not need it. So no longer is it a one-size-fits-all model. You need a much more modern and flexible set of principles around your end-user compute strategy that explicitly answers the sort of questions that you're raising there.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting point when it comes to compliance, because complying with some sort of external obligation is only the first step in maturity. Actually understanding why, or even more importantly, why you're choosing to deviate, shows a much higher level of capability and business alignment.
Exactly.
Very interesting. Okay, next slide, Compass, digital workspace strategy. Please talk us through this.
Right, so look, I won't go through this in its entirety, but the clear thing is that if you're planning to meet that middle sweet spot by implementing a digital workspace strategy, and bear in mind, these do look slightly different for every organization. They have similar approaches and similar concepts, but they really need to be tailored, because what you're trying to do is get to an endpoint where the workforce can start innovating using these new tools, genuinely innovating. So we needed to come up with a framework that allowed organizations to figure out what their strategy should be around next generation end user computing, or this digital workspace that we're talking about, but also make that framework so that it was bimodal, so that it both enabled the strategy of the organization to come through, but also this innovation which actually happens at the ground, at the grassroots of the organization, at the ground level. So to do that, we interviewed many people. We've actually put this framework into practice, and we've refined it over the years, leading to this current version. And basically, it's 5 stages. So if you want to head in this direction, take a look at this framework. Again, you can download it. It's part of the Compass that we've got available for you. But the key points I'd like to point out is that stage 1 and 2 are absolutely critical, and it's where all the mistakes happen. If anything's going to go wrong, it's in stage 1 and 2. In stage 1, you need to do a couple of things. First of all, you need to use a model that maps the business benefits to the strategy of the organization. And that's really to gain clarity not on requirements, it's to gain clarity on what functions does the organization need to change in order to enable those benefits. And then once you understand that, you then understand what type of capabilities the technology will need to enable that business to change in that way. So you really are starting with a strategy-led approach there, reverse engineering it. That's the top-down. The second part, and this is what many organizations overlook, is that you need to do grounded research. You need to go out and talk to the workforce, literally the people doing the job, and you need to find out what's getting in the way of them doing their job. And it's incredible. Once you actually have this conversation, you'll see that there's a lot of ideas out there. Too many ideas. And it's very tempting to say, oh, there's a quick win, we can do that. No. You need to bring all of this stuff, all these ideas together, and then you need to synthesize them, which is what happens in stage 2. This is the hard part. You need to create simplicity out of the massive amount of complexity and challenges and problems that you're getting from both levels. We call this generalization or generalized use cases. From that, you'll normally get 3 to 4 big, important, if you will, programs of work around end user compute that will shape your focus and your priority for the Digital Workspaces initiative. There are a number of other patterns that emerge out of that as well. We've actually identified 8 of them, but usually most organizations have 3 to 4 that really are clear and present winners. Now from that, you can then do a gap analysis to see what technology have you got now and what skills do you have now to enable this to happen. That's standard gap analysis. We've been doing that for years. You do an options analysis. You figure out what types and what mixes of technology, not a one size fits all, what mixes of technology will now be used to achieve those 3 to 4 big use cases. And finally, you would formulate your roadmap from that. So it's not, it sounds like a lot of work, but in reality, you can do stages 1 and 2 within a month to 2 months. It's not a hard piece of work, but it does need to get done with absolute rigor and absolute intentionality of looking for those opportunities. The rest of it is basically analysis work and then going back to the organization.
Okie dokie. Well, it sounds like there's quite a lot of information there in the full compass. That's huge.
Yep, there's a lot of work there.